Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Friday the 10th of October 2025. In a couple of weeks, I'm thrilled to announce that I'm going to be doing an interview with my old friend Tim Wu, very influential thinker about the digital economy. He has a new book out, The Age of Extraction, How Tech Platforms Conquered the Economy and Threaten Our Future Prosperity. Tim is always a bellwether. He's become increasingly pessimistic. He was very much involved in the Biden administration and has become pessimistic about the way in which the tech platforms are creating inequality. It'll be an interesting conversation. One man, though, has been thinking about tech platforms for many years, is my guest today. Sangeet Choudary was the co-author of Platform Revolution. I think it was back in 2017. He's the author of Platform Scale, and his latest book is Reshuffle, Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy, which is about the implications of AI on our platforms. Sangeet is joining us from Dubai, where he spends most of his time. His day job is at Platform Revolution. He is a consultant on our new platform economy, and I'm thrilled that he's joining our show. Sangeet, welcome. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to have a look at Tim Wu's book, The Age of Extraction, yet, but are you, in some ways, you're a business consultant rather than a political analyst, Sangeet, but are you concerned, like Tim, with the way in which this new platform economy could compound inequality and make the big seven, the big tech companies, ever increasingly dominant and unaccountable?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for having me here. I'm absolutely concerned about that. It's something I've written extensively about as well. I think there are multiple mechanisms through which there is a much more extractive economy that gets created because of platforms today. While there's no denying the fact that platforms unlock a lot of value because they organize fragmented markets, the challenge is that they combine this value creation with simultaneously also organizing a mechanism by which they enclose what is typically supposed to be a public good, our data, and they extract that and they use that to create different forms of products that helps them extract at scale. And the challenge with that is that when before the rise of the current generation of platforms, the big tech that we see over here, traditional platforms prior to that were not necessarily structured around capturing or extracting data. If you think about the payment networks that came up in the past, they were largely based on the logic of enabling connectivity and then capturing, some portion of the value that was created over there.
So you would be talking about a company like AT&T or Verizon?
Yes, also Visa and MasterCard prior to that. But in all of those cases, the mechanism was different. And the other thing that's, that there's a challenge with today is a concept that I call out in Reshuffle, which is that there's a distinction between work that is performed above the algorithm and work performed below the algorithm. So take the classic example of Uber. There's a distinction between the Uber data scientist who is designing an algorithmic system and an Uber driver who is being controlled, whose rates are being set, whose access to jobs are being determined by the algorithm. And while traditionally we used to have this capital labor distinction, today the bigger distinction is the inequality is really between those who perform above the algorithm and create these systems and those who are captured below the algorithm and whose access to opportunities and monetization are determined by the algorithm.
So let's historicize this idea of platforms, Sangeet. Is Google the first true platform company? Should we begin our history when in 50 or 100 years the real histories of our platform economy are written? Will they begin with Google?
Well, I think the nature of what we consider, or how these platforms work, has certainly changed. So let me first start by just giving a very generic definition of a platform. A platform is
Excellent. Yeah, I was
fundamentally.
going to ask you that. That's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So a platform is fundamentally a mechanism to coordinate multiple parties to co-create value and to exchange value. Now, one way of doing that is, if you take the Google example, um, Google is organizing information across the internet. So in some way, it's helping web publishers determine how to get discovered. On the other side, it's helping consumers find information. And there are many different mechanisms through which platforms create value. Closer to the customer, it could be through enabling market transactions. Further away from the customer, further upstream in the value chain, it could involve bringing different stakeholders together to create value together. And a simple way to think about that is Wikipedia. It's not just a simple transaction. It's a collaboration medium where multiple players are working together to create a new article. But if you take that same example into any industrial process that requires coordination among multiple actors can be reorganized on a platform. So if you think of a platform from those perspectives as a way to organize value creation and exchange among various participants, we've had two generations of platforms, I would say, before the rise of the internet. So in the past, the Greek agoras or the medieval marketplaces were in a way platforms because they created a physical space where people could come together and exchange value, but they were physically constrained. And then in the pre-internet 20th century, we had Visa, MasterCard, the global distribution systems like Amadeus and Sabre, which essentially connected supply on one side and demand on the other, but largely created a new network infrastructure to connect the two sides. What the current platform economy has really mushroomed and grown, because all of it has come on top of this commoditized network infrastructure which exists as the internet, and then eventually came up as the smartphone connected user base as well. And so in this economy, it's the eBays and the Amazons and the Googles which have been the first generation of platforms that have really come up. So I would trace that as sort of the history. And it's really the fact that the value is no longer in the network connectivity, but in the interactions that happen on top. That's where capturing data becomes so central to this value proposition today.
A lot of stories these days, Sangeet, about antitrust and how these platforms should be controlled. Mm-hmm. Are platforms, by definition, if not monopolies, wannabe monopolies? Is this whole shift towards platform economics, the desire, and Peter Thiel, of course, writes about this in his book about monopolies, 0 to 1, in which he's actually sympathetic to the idea of a monopoly. Are they all attempts by new companies like Amazon and eBay and Google to create more, shall we say, and I use this word carefully, efficient monopolies?
They, especially if we look at this entire generation of consumer side platforms that came up in, between the late 90s and the early 2010s, which is today's big tech essentially. A lot of them were structured around the idea of exploiting a significant technological shift to capture a large user base and to then figure out ways to organize that user base. Whether it was Facebook organizing its user bases through a social graph, or Amazon organizing interactions by owning key market making mechanisms, or Apple and Google capturing their respective app stores. These were cases of platforms emerging at significant discontinuous moments where they then had an early advantage in organizing the new value that was being created. And because of the fact that they had both the ability to scale through network effects. The more producers come on board, the more consumers want to come on board, and so on. They scale through network effects, and if you look specifically at Amazon, they also selectively chose positions across the value chain, where Amazon provides not just the marketplace, it also connects that with its warehousing system, it also connects it with its advertising system, and essentially has moved from a 15% transaction cut to close to a 45% transaction cut on its transactions today. So the key point that I'm trying to make over here is that this was a unique set of companies that came out at a time where vast user bases were being organized in a fundamentally new way. And when we look specifically at these companies, I believe they are fundamentally different from a lot of other companies that say they are platform companies, but have not really had the ability to exploit a similar discontinuous shift. So for these companies, for sure, there is, they are monopolies. They are very efficient monopolies in a way that's very different from a lot of other companies that also try to be platforms.
So is the platform economy, is it a kind of winner-take-all economics? I mean, once you seize control, to use maybe a Marxist word, of this economy, is it very hard to catch up? And these are the core arguments about Google in the antitrust case. The Google lawyers say, well, anyone can just shift search engine. They don't have to use Google. They can use something else. It's just a click of the mouse. But of course, it's more complicated than that. So once Amazon or Facebook or Google or Apple, in their own different ways, have created these platform, these dominant platforms, does it make it almost impossible to catch up, at least in market terms, without some sort of regulatory intervention?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects to that answer. So the first thing is that if we take Google as an example, Google is not just providing a search service, it's managing a much larger ecosystem of players through a range of different control mechanisms. So the fact that every publisher has to optimize their website for Google's guidelines, what we call search engine optimization, creates a certain form of soft power that Google has across publishers all across the internet. And so it disincentivizes users from moving to other search engines, because the publishers themselves, the website owners, are optimizing to be found on Google. So in general, whether we look at that, whether we look at Google's choice to give away Google Maps for free, even though it's so expensive to maintain maps, just so that its search could be distributed through Android. If we look at their efforts with Chrome, all of these are different forms of control to ensure that Google retains a monopoly in search. So the first thing to think about is that you don't look at Google as a standalone search service. It's a set or a system of complementary control mechanisms which are together ensuring that the search service remains a monopoly. But the second thing I would call out is that when you see the next technological discontinuity that we have seen with the rise of ChatGPT and large language models, those are moments when a fundamentally new behavior can shift user bases entirely. And that's one of the key threats that a platform would have, which is a new technological discontinuity that would move users into a fundamentally new behavior.
Yeah, and I want to come to that. I mean, that's the core of your book and the core of the conversation. Who wins? The subtitle of your new book, Reshuffle. Who wins when AI restacks the knowledge economy? The restacking is the disruption of the traditional platform. Before AI, Sangeet, have there been any examples of internet platforms which have been successfully challenged and undermined?
I think every moment of technological discontinuity has challenged the previous model. So even though we don't think of Yahoo as a platform, Yahoo's initial bet was to organize the information of the internet. It's just that it tried to do it editorially, and the internet had started to scale non-linearly, so the editorial model did not work. And you could say the same thing for the shift from feature phones to smartphones, because feature phones themselves had a dominant model, and the fact that you could eventually move to a place where apps could be hosted on the cloud, move the power away from the level of the phone to the level of a platform where any number of cloud hosted applications could be managed. So typically, depending on how we define this term, technological substitution happens when there are such discontinuous moments. So AI is, very clearly a discontinuous moment in the present. But we've seen this happen with previous shifts as well. Whether we think of Adobe being challenged by a company like Figma, or we think of traditional game developers being challenged by Roblox. All of these the new players have always used a new technological paradigm to restructure how the business model works in a way that the traditional firm could not effectively copy them.
Yeah, and you have an interesting post on your Substack, from railroads to Roblox. So this has happened before, even before the internet, with railroads.
That's right.
And it's interesting you bring up cell phones. I mean, I guess you could argue that Nokia was a platform monopolist, and of course ask the Finns or ask the people at Nokia, and it no longer is. So let's get to AI, which is the great disruption, perhaps the greatest of all digital disruptions. You write about it in your new book, Reshuffle, of course, driven by OpenAI and their championing of generative artificial intelligence, which has revolutionized technology. How different is this technological innovation, AI and generative AI, particularly OpenAI's involvement in this, from previous historical disruptions, Sangeet?
Well, one of the cases, or one of the points that I make in my book, is that a really good way to understand our current moment in AI is to understand that it's not entirely different from some of the previous innovations. That does not mean that it's not going to fundamentally change how the world works. But in order to understand that, we need to, contextualize ourselves in certain previous innovations, which, even though they seemed very small, they fundamentally transformed how the world works. And I take the example of the shipping container to kind of make this point, because the shipping container in itself does not seem like a very advanced technology. But the reason it was so powerful was that it completely transformed reliability in trade. Because when ships, trains, and trucks agreed on a standardized version of the shipping container, it enabled goods to be moved from source to destination reliably. Before that, we were in the era of break bulk cargo, and cargo used to get slowed down at ports, and moving cargo from one transport to another made essentially shipping very unreliable. And when shipping became reliable, the whole paradigm of manufacturing, the paradigm of trade fundamentally changed. Companies no longer had to co-locate with their suppliers. Suppliers could be far flung across the world. Manufacturing got unbundled, and component level competition came up, and global supply chains essentially changed how globalization worked and which countries gained strength geopolitically. So I think the key point that I'm trying to make is that we talk about AI as being fundamentally different very often because we think that AI is is the most profound manifestation of intelligence and technology, and we also look for we also test AI against benchmarks which are always related to intelligence. But my key point is that even dumb technologies like the shipping container fundamentally restructure the world. And what's really holding back AI today is not really how intelligent it is or how what benchmarks it performs on, but the fact that the largest socio-technical system into which technologies are deployed are not yet leveraging the power of AI as it stands today. So the key point that I try to make is actually, flips the argument and says that even before we think about AI as a fundamentally different technology, let's first unpack its potential as a normal technology, and in the vein of previous technologies, and we haven't even started doing that.
Yeah, and you had an interesting post from your Substack on 5 unlikely books to understand how AI transforms the economy. And one of the books you recommend is by Mark Levinson, a classic book on the box, on the history of the shipping container. So where are we, Sangeet, in the emergence, shall we say, of the AI platform, the stack. There was a very interesting piece, I'm sure you saw it in Bloomberg earlier this week,
Right.
about OpenAI and NVIDIA fueling a $1 trillion AI market with a web of circular deals. There are more and more deals between OpenAI and NVIDIA and AMD, Microsoft, Oracle. All these big players are doing deals with each other. Now, pessimists are saying it's just creating a massive artificial boom that will eventually collapse, perhaps bring the entire world economy down with it, given the dominance of the big seven in Wall Street. But I'm wondering whether these deals are part, shall we say, of the action of these new platforms, the big players, whether it's NVIDIA or OpenAI or Oracle. Are they all recognizing that they need to own the platform or be part of the platform or eliminate others from the platform? What's actually happening here?
Well, there are a couple of factors over here. So I'll just try to unpack each of these in turn. The first point that I want to make is that there is a lot of hype around AI today, and that hype is very much a feature, not a bug. It's a feature of the current economy that we live in, because we are in an economy which is attention poor and capital heavy. And in an attention poor economy, if you want to allocate capital, hype is one of the best mechanisms to attract capital in your direction. And so that's, to a large extent, all these companies have been relying heavily on that, which essentially often means that they end up selling stories that are far from the actual business value that's going to be realized in the short term. And so they have to keep selling stories about long-term value, which is why the AGI narrative becomes so important to or so central to hype.
Sorry, which narrative did you say?
AGI, artificial general intelligence, right? You have to keep a goalpost that is relatively far. You have to keep changing the timeline on when you get there, but that's how you keep attention allocated towards hype and not towards real-time business results. And so I think we're sort of reaching a place in that cycle where some of these players realize that attention is shifting from the hype to where's the business result. And that's why you're starting to see these circular deals coming in, because that's a second way you can keep propping up valuations. You can keep ensuring that the hype or the valuation itself becomes self-fulfilling in a way. So I think those are really the symptoms of the time that we are living in. There are obvious, clear indications of power within the AI stack itself. OpenAI just came out with its own marketplace of applications recently, and I think that's a really interesting move, because unlike the app stores that Apple and Android came up with back in the days of the smartphone, the creating applications on top of OpenAI is relatively more skewed towards OpenAI as a platform versus towards the application, because AI with AI we have this unique power to move across applications and have seamless workflows across applications, which essentially allows OpenAI to constantly learn from which applications are being built by startups in its marketplace and introduce workflows on top that connect across these applications and commoditize them. And we did not see that with mobility, because in mobile app stores, in smartphone app stores, you had to engage with the application. You had to move in and out of applications. So while the platform had a lot of power, the workflow was tied to an application. With AI, the workflow often gets abstracted away from the application. You can easily just call functions from different applications in one single chat interface. And so I think that's there's some new power dynamics which are very interesting that might emerge over there. So I just wanted to give both sides of the story. I think there's very genuine value and power that's being created, but it is far outstripped by the amount of hype and circular deals that you just talked about.
Yeah, and those circular deals are all these big companies, from AI to NVIDIA to Oracle. They're all jostling for dominance. And the same was happening, of course, in the 90s. There were winners and losers. Cisco was the big winner. At one point, Cisco was the most valuable company in the world. Now it's a footnote to a footnote, whereas Amazon almost crashed and now has become a dominant platform. You're Mr. Platform, Sangeet. So who do you fancy? There are only a handful, maybe one winner in the platform wars. Are you more or less optimistic about core tech companies like Nvidia and Oracle versus specifically AI companies like OpenAI and maybe even Anthropic? Who would you, I mean, obviously it's impossible to forecast, but who do you fancy dominating this new AI platform? Owning the platform, so to speak. We've done lots of shows on the way in which AI wants to own the platform, whether Sam Altman has the skill. He certainly has the chutzpah to carry it out, but whether he has the skill and the technology and the resources, the capital to carry out is another matter.
Yeah, I think in if you look at these the big companies and the names that are given out regularly, there are at least 3 points in the AI stack where I believe power will concentrate. One is at the level of the inference, which is where NVIDIA plays. Because it is a core supplier at the bottom of the stack, there is a lot of value that will be captured there, and it's sort of fully priced to some extent in the current hype around NVIDIA. The second layer is right up close to the customer, which is probably not talked about enough, because the extent to which power and value will be captured there is not entirely clear, just because the customer workflows are so different. But I would really bet on companies like Google to have a strong play over there, especially because even prior to AI, they had the ability to provide enterprise-wide workflow software. Even Microsoft, for that instance, they have these investments and they have the relationships in the enterprise. They have to use all of those complementary capabilities to unlock the power of AI in the workflow. That is the part that has not been exploited yet, and that is where the jury is still out in terms of whether it will be a Google or a Microsoft that ends up winning it, whether it will be a completely new company like a Glean or a Notion that ends up winning it. So that's the part that is still a layer where the winners are unclear. And then I believe the model layer in between in itself will and is already getting commoditized. The most of the value will move towards the top or towards the bottom of the stack. And knowing that the model layer will get commoditized is it is something that shows through in OpenAI strategy as well. It constantly improves the model to keep creating the market and keep advancing the market it has created, but it's constantly also shifting up the stack closer to the workflow layer in order to really bet over there. And I think that those are the two key places where the winners will emerge.
Well, you've mentioned NVIDIA and Google and Microsoft. You didn't mention OpenAI. Is it conceivable that they'll end up as the Cisco of this revolution? Just a footnote.
I think they're trying their best to get to playing up in the workflow layer. So I talked about OpenAI more from the point of they've created the market and they're constantly pushing the market, but I think staying at the level of the model is not going to help. They have to get up into the workflow, and the disadvantage they have compared to a Microsoft or a Google is they don't have access to those complementary capabilities in the workflow that a Microsoft or Google has with 30 years of playing in that space.
Sangeet, you're talking to me from Dubai. You're of Indian heritage. You're all too familiar with the East Asian economy. It's very different in 2025 than it was in 1995. Can China or indeed India, startups, new AI companies, can they change everything in what you call this reshuffle revolution when AI restacks the knowledge economy? Is it no longer purely a US story?
I think in terms of innovation, it's at the moment it's in AI, it's very heavily a US and China story. We see relatively less innovation come out of India. But if we look at it geopolitically, all these four countries have very different postures. And I'm adding a fourth country, which is UAE, where Dubai is. And I think it's interesting to think about the UAE as well, alongside India, China, and the US as four different postures in this new landscape. So the US is very much private enterprise driven, with the government now increasingly you know getting very deeply in bed with these private actors. China is sort of the other way around, where the government's posture is to let innovation happen, and the moment something gets discovered, uh, they try to absorb that and capture power back in the direction of the government and away from the private sector. Um, uh, India is interesting because even though there's not a lot of innovation happening over there at this point in time, India has invested over the past 10 years in creating the world's largest base of digital public infrastructure, with its identity capabilities, with Aadhaar, with the India Stack, which is a whole range of digital public infrastructure to manage your identity, payments, your data. All of that has set up India very well to create a fundamentally new model in which AI innovation can happen, where several layers of the stack can be commoditized, and where more citizen centric or more user centric AI solutions can be created. One of the key ideas that they're betting on is a future where the data can sit with the user, and the user gets paid in order to train AI on their data. And there are several efforts that are underway on that front. And then I'll just complement that with the UAE's posture, which is quite interesting, because the UAE's posture has been that they sit on these oil reserves, and they essentially participate in global trade by exporting oil. And they're now just in this unique moment where the physical and digital value chains are merging, and instead of exporting oil, they can burn oil to create compute, to create inference, and then sell AI services as they export, that they sell out there, and essentially punch further higher up in the value chain. So it's very interesting how all of these companies have, or how all of these countries have very different geopolitical postures, and that's something that is shaping the current moment.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's particularly intriguing that you include UAE in it because of their oil reserves as a player in the new the new game of winning, of creating power to power energy to power the AI economy. You haven't mentioned Western Europe, maybe not uncoincidentally, Sangeet. Tim Wu had an interesting piece this week in the FT, warning Britain not to become like Nebraska, not to become bottom of the stack by simply providing power. Is Western Europe now, it's not even the Cisco, I don't know, it's the pre-Cisco of this. Does Western Europe have any chance of playing in this new reshuffle in platform, in the global platform AI economy? Or are they destined to become, to borrow some language from Tim Wu, are they destined to become like Nebraska, just bottom of the stack?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I've worked with regulators across the EU since 2014, and very early on, back in 2014 or 15, the EU made a choice that they wanted to take a pro-regulation stance. The challenge, though, was that they did not have a pro-innovation economy to complement it, and they've bet very heavily on the pro-regulation stance. It has helped them in certain cases. In most cases, though, it's shown that while the rest of the world operates more in the Wild West and drives innovation forward, an excessively pro-regulation stance actually cuts you out of all the progress that's happening. So I think we are sort of in a time where traditional institutional forms that were built for a different world are not necessarily the right uh, places to regulate innovation, which is happening in cycles that these institutional forms cannot keep up with. And while I am pro regulation, because the big problem with platforms today, and I'm sure Tim would agree with this because it traces all the way back to his work on the master switch. The big problem with platforms today is that they capture what was traditionally a market mechanism. Traditionally, we thought of solving problems in the, in firms versus in markets, but platforms are essentially firms that capture market mechanisms, and that's not something that's very healthy when you allow market-wide governance being captured by a single firm. And so, from that perspective, I am pro-regulation, but the institutional structures that the EU is using in order to get towards that pro-regulation stance is not going to help them. It's not effective, and so I think that's the real challenge. Unless we get to more distributed forms of governance where data from platforms is actually opened out, network of think tanks work to analyze it, do proactive governance as a result of that. Unless we get to some form of that rather than the current litigation based model, we're not going to catch up with the speed of innovation that we have today.
Tim also wrote an interesting piece about Trump earlier this year in the New York Times, suggesting that Trump's economy looks like command capitalism. It seems as if the Trump government is very much supportive of US AI companies. OpenAI, to Sam Altman is particularly close now to Trump. There's a long history, of course, of Musk and Trump, a complicated history. Does that mean, in your view, Sangeet, that the US and the Chinese models of, shall we say, state-led capitalism when it comes to this AI revolution are becoming more and more similar?
I think they are similar in terms of the outcome that they lead to, which is state-backed protection to capture rents associated with innovation. They are dissimilar in the extent to which those rents are captured in the private sector. So I think in the US, it's still largely captured in the private sector and in the markets, but in China, less so. And that model has worked well for China. It's difficult to replicate that in other countries. But in terms of the outcome that both of these are leading to, yes, it's very similar outcomes that they're leading to.
How exciting is it in other spheres? There was an interesting announcement this week that Ari Emanuel, an LA-based talent man, Hollywood agent, has raised $3 billion from investors to boost leisure time based on 3-day working week and new kinds of platforms to exploit our AI age. Are there new platforms that we haven't even imagined that will come into place in the next few years, ones like Ari Emanuel is imagining?
I think they're fundamentally new fundamentally new value pools, if I could just abstract it a little away from that, which can be created because of AI. And if you look at what Larry Ellison is doing with, I think his son acquired Paramount, and their whole goal is to essentially rethink or reimagine the cost structure of Hollywood by automating or
and they just bought Free Press this week for $150 million. Although
exactly,
Larry Ellison and David Ellison, I mean, they're father and son, but I'm not sure they're necessarily always in business together.
Okay, if you look at, let me give David Ellison the full credit then. But there's a significant opportunity that he's going after, which is automate or substitute all the human talent that does not have brand power. So all the background actors, etc., which are all a line item on the P&L, but can be converted to a zero marginal cost input in the future of entertainment. So I think this idea of fundamentally changing the economics of a system or of a value chain, because you are changing an expensive input into a zero marginal cost input, is going to happen increasingly as we move forward. And this is one of the theses that I kind of push through subtly in Reshuffle as well, that a lot of the innovation in the early 2010s happened closer to the customer. That's where the big tech came out, and most of that innovation was protected by capturing data and capturing market mechanisms like reputation systems, recommendation systems, and so on. A lot of the innovation in the mid 2010s happened in the middle of the value chain, where we saw the rise of the API economy and microservices, and we saw the real value of cloud computing kind of coming through over there. But a lot of innovation over the next 10 years, I believe, is going to happen at the level of inputs. And that, going back to your question, are there fundamentally new platforms? I think input based platforms are going to be very important, and AI is one such input, because it's an input into any value chain. You could take Hollywood, you could take a plastics company, you could take an energy company, and you could transform all of them using AI. So AI is a rapidly improving input, which can transform an entire value chain. But so there are other inputs that are evolving at similar rates. There's synthetic biology improvements, there's improvements in materials sciences, there's improvements in energy, all of which traditionally used to be our economy used to work on commoditized inputs and most of the value captured at the level of the product. But we're sort of entering this new phase, I believe, where the rate of innovation in the input and the rate of capital allocation towards inputs is going to be so high that it will unlock fundamentally new platforms across the economy. And that I believe is a huge opportunity going forward.
Yeah, you've given a lot of thought to the history of platforms. As I said, you wrote an interesting essay, From Railroads to Roadblocks. This week, America's top banker, Jamie Dimon, at least according to the BBC, sounded a warning on a crash, a US stock market fall, driven by all this froth around AI. Are you as fearful as Dimon?
I think in about a current hype, I think a correction is long overdue. Now, to what extent that correction is actually based on fundamentals versus, the Fed finds another way to prop the market up or not, that's a different question. But I think the correction is long overdue. As I mentioned, the hype far exceeds any short to medium term returns on the current technologies that are out there. So I agree with him on that basis.
Of course, the question is what kind of correction would be, like the dot-com correction or the Wall Street crash correction? We'll know about that certainly in the next few years. Finally, Sangeet, I gave a speech last week in Amsterdam asking whether big tech can be trusted to design our agentic future, our AI future. And I noted in the speech that even today, the big seven now, if you add their valuation together, they're about $20 trillion, which is about a third of the entire global economy. With this AI revolution, all that's going to be compounded. So what would be your answer if you were giving a speech about whether or not we can trust big tech with our agentic future? Can we trust these guys to design it? And if we can't, what are we going to do?
I don't think we can trust the big tech to design our agentic future, because the one thing that we still have in today's big tech economy is agency. Even though they have our data, we still have the agency to click. They have the ability to, manipulate our attention, but we still have the agency to click. And if we give that agency away in our agentic future, which is essentially what this agentic future is going to look like, there's going to be even more extraction and even more ways to
yeah, and that got previewed last week when OpenAI previewed Pulse, which does take away our agency, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where we really need to see who has the incentives to create an alternate structure. And what's happening in India is interesting from that perspective, because the push towards innovating with AI over there is to create a model where the data sits in a data wallet with the user. They already have the technology to do that, and that's how the India stack is built. But we really need to create the right incentives to move away from a data hoarding economy, because today most of the business models that we naturally gravitate towards are built around the assumption of data hoarding. And if you add Agentic on top of that, then there is no agency left with the user.
Well, on that rather depressing note, Sangeet Paul Choudary, the author of Reshuffle. We'll have to get you back on the show, Sangeet, maybe with Tim Wu in the future to talk about the Indian model as an alternative where you don't have so much control of data. Thank you so much, Sangeet, and we'll get you back on. Real honor to have you on the show.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been such a pleasure. Really appreciate it.